After all the very technical presentations of today, I want to add a little bit of a different perspective here and look a bit more on the overall governance structure and how will this system then be implemented at the national level or at an international level, probably. Trying to see my screen in a different way. Okay. And it's about how do we develop, well, and I've called it a renewable carbon value chain, because basically I think we need to look at plastics as a source of carbon, and it's carbon that we've stored now in the urban mine. Different numbers have been given about how much plastics we've been generating in the past years, and indeed a lot of that has not been recycled, but also not even incinerated, so it's still there somewhere. So how can we make that into a renewable carbon? I work for VITO. VITO is a research institute, if you want to know. So it's like TNO in the Netherlands. We are a bit smaller though, so we have around 1,000 employees, 45 nationalities, all working, well, mainly working in Flanders. And so there I'm responsible for our work on circular economy and recycling. The starting point of this presentation is a bit, again, looking back in some press releases in the past few weeks, also during the Corona crisis, where it became very apparent that the oil prices that went down put a lot of pressure on the plastics recycling sector. And although, most of that said, look, it's going to be very difficult. How will the recycling sector survive? What I liked was this title in the Vlaamse Ondernemer, in a Flemish magazine, which said that we need more collaboration if we want to develop the recycling system. And that's sort of one of the first giveaways, I think, or one of the first conclusions probably of my presentation, and I'll tell you more why I think this is the case. Talking about numbers, it's very clear that plastic is not always recycled, although we call it recycled. There have been updates on that in the more recent legislation, so the circular economy package and the new waste management legislation has changed the definition of what we call recycled. Rather than it being the material that we bring into the sorting plant, it will now be the material that comes out of the sorting plant. So we discard some of the residue, but it doesn't mean that everything that comes out of the sorting plant is indeed also recycled. And what happens to the material? Well, a lot of the plastics are traded, and not all of them go really into recycling processes. This graph here comes out of a report from the European Environment Agency, for whom we work a lot. And it shows in blue the amount of plastics that went from EU 28 to China. Over the years, we started at 2015, and you see this sudden reduction in 2018. But we also see that there's new countries that have come into place. And for instance, Turkey is a newcomer in taking off European plastics. And this has been in the news in the Netherlands in the past weeks. It has been shown that not all that plastic is recycled, let's say. Another interesting figure is this graph, which we made for the Environment Agency, which basically tried to put a number on what is then actually recycled. So besides the legal definition of what we can count as recycled, what is it that goes actually into recycling? And it's a bit disappointing because it's only, well, it's a little bit less than 20% of the plastics in general. And here we're talking plastics in general, not only packaging waste, that is. So there's around 80% of the plastics that get lost. That's because there's a lot of residue. There was just this discussion between Martin and Christine about the PET trays. Yeah, they're very difficult to recycle. So in the end, that sort of material, it gets incinerated, or it gets to a different, or it gets landfilled or into export. So here we've grouped all that as being lost. And why is it important to get ideas about that? Because of course, we want to get the greenhouse gases right. We want to reduce greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas balance of the of our plastics. And from that perspective, this is an interesting graph. Because if we look at plastics, then yeah, from this climate perspective, from the perspective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, where do we need to act? How do we need to look at this sector? Well, if on average, you can say that 1 ton of plastics generates 5 tons of CO2. And this comes from a Chinese article, but we're developing similar numbers now for Europe, for European plastics, but it was too early to propose them already in this presentation, but they will be launched soon. But the general sizes remain the same. 60% of the CO2 generation comes from production and 40% in the conversion and the end of life phase. It means that, well, if we would just change the recycling, or we stop the incineration or do something there, of course, we haven't solved the greenhouse gas emission of all the cycle. So in the first place, it's important to realize that, that if you want to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity, you need to also look at the production side, or you need to look at dematerialization and producing less plastics in order to bring down the overall greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, if you increase the recycling, it has a double effect. It reduces, on the one hand, it reduces the emissions at the end of life phase, because recycling emits less than incineration does. And on the other hand, it prevents the production of new plastics, so you can also diminish let's say the blue part of the circle here. So recycling has an interesting aspect also from the point of CO2 reduction. This is just, and I like this graph, it's just a new way of sort of showing this. An interesting thing that happened last week is I was interviewed for a national newspaper in Flanders, the Standaard, and it was about this fact that in LCA studies, people are focusing very much on plastics and on plastic packaging. And there was an American article which said, look, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a bit connected to my previous slide, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, maybe we should not only focus on the packaging. It's not packaging which is the most important environmental problem in the world, because if we want to deal with climate effects, we will need to think about our production and consumption system. It's the whole system that needs to change. The interesting thing is that this article then came in the press, and on the first day it was picked up by the Green Party. Mieke Schouwvliegen, she's in the Flemish Parliament for the Green Party, so she liked very much the title and the quote that we gave here. We need to think in materials and cycles, and if we think about throw away single-use plastic, it's not the plastic that's a problem, but it's the throw-away culture. It's the fact that we use things only once. That's very nice, but what happened in the few days after that, because I also tweeted this, I found out that suddenly then Essentia also liked it, and Essentia, they're the sector federation of the chemistry. And next to that, INEOS also started to like my quote about this. And that's very interesting, because in Flanders, there's a very big debate ongoing between INEOS and the Green Party about whether or not we should build this additional plastics plant. So what we see is that recycling, systems thinking about how do we change the plastic cycle, brings together those different aspects, brings together those different people to talk to each other. And that's an interesting thing. So I think that's what we also need to focus on. It's how do we put now this recycling into the plastics system, and how do we make sure that we can set up a better system that has a lower climate emission in the end. And one of the important approaches that we as VITO see there is the product perspective. Until now, far too often, we've been thinking about waste as something that is lying there. It is there. It is generated by our society, and it's a problem. And the question is always, if there is this massive amount of 8 million tons of plastic waste going into the ocean, how do we treat it? It's a problem and it's lying there. But we think we should reverse our way of thinking. We should think about which type of product do we want to make. We want to make an rPET bottle, which is a transparent food-grade material. And then we need to think back, which type of quality does the rPET manufacturer, the bottle manufacturer, need to get into his factory? And from that perspective, we need to design our collection system or our production system. So it's a plea to sort of change the way we think, not say, look, it's all this waste, and then how do we deal with it? And we keep producing whatever waste there is. We need to think about what is the recycled quality of material that we need, and how do we make sure that the collection system provides that sort of material. And if you think, and as Christine was just saying, that there's a lack of PET bottles in the market, if you think of it that way, it provides with additional arguments, for instance, to introduce a system where you have a fee on PET bottles, so that you can assure that people bring them back, that they bring them back separately, clean, and ready to be recycled. So from that perspective, we need to re-evaluate our collection systems, do material flow analysis, and to see how we can optimize the system looking from the product perspective. And of course, that will then also include thinking about chemical recycling of plastics and thinking about the quality criteria that apply in those type of systems, but it will also lead us to rethinking product design. And that brings us to chemical recycling, which is, as I see it, a way to set up a closed carbon loop. We've seen this picture earlier this morning, so I will not go too much into detail or explain it again. It has been taken from the European Commission plastic strategy. So there's various ways of setting up this closed carbon loop. And what is then the role of chemical recycling in this whole story? Well, I think that, well, we need to expand the recycling system, and it's clear that there's a gap which is left by mechanical recycling, and it's that gap that needs to be filled by chemical recycling. We also think that urban mining is necessary to transition into a renewable carbon economy. There's a lot of plastics that sit around in the society. There's stocks of material that we've been piling up. All those petro-based chemicals which have been transferred into plastics, and they're still there. We need to get them back out of the society, out of the urban mine, and recycle them and use the carbon that's available there. Chemical recycling will also allow to close material loops at a more local level. So we don't need to ship the material out of Europe, but we can really keep the material here and set up local closed loops. And that will probably be a way to enable the resilience of the European chemical industry in their transition away from petroleum, in their transition away from the oil, which is just also in this very linear system where we process it and then put it into single-use products or into fuels. So that's the position that chemical recycling needs to take, and that's why we also need to really develop chemical recycling as part of the whole renewable carbon system. It's interesting from that perspective to have a look in the new Flemish action plan on plastics, which was recently launched. And I just taken out a few actions that OVAM, the Flemish Waste Authority, so the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, wants to take. The first is that they want to set up the recycling of packaging, and they say it should be done as much as possible in the EU and preferably in Belgium. This is sort of a warning to the Chemelot colleagues, saying, look, if it comes to the Flemish Waste Authority, there appears to be some sort of a competition, and well, you should question. Well, I want to question that, of course. Should this be then in Belgium? Well, let's say that we need to do this within the existing chemical sector, and that we want to integrate this sort of activity to strengthen the existing chemical sector in this full ARA region, as we said earlier today. Of course, we will need also to have fiscal instruments to stimulate the market for recycled plastic aggregates and granulates. There's also another way of supporting this. We need a harmonized and affordable verification system for recycled content at European and worldwide level. There's different ways of doing this. Earlier today, systems were mentioned. But we also think that here, blockchain technology, for instance, can play an important role. And of course, all this goes together with consequent idea that we need to ban the use of single-use catering materials. Here, the action for the Flemish government is to do it in the whole Flemish administration and local government, but this should be indeed an approach that we need to set up and stimulate and keep on focusing on. So what does this mean for chemical recycling strategies? I think we need to realize that at the moment, there's more than 1.5 million tons of plastics exported outside of the EU by EU countries. If you look at the current installations that are being set up, each technology and installation has very strict input criteria. We've been discussing this today. But also current initiatives are always in the range of 50 to 100 kilotons. It means that there is no true competition. There is room in Europe for a wide range of this sort of installations. And what we see is that happens not often enough is that the companies that take these initiatives, that they talk to each other. There should be more of a more discussion so that a complementary recycling infrastructure can be set up. Different companies are focusing on different technologies. Those are not in competition with each other. Those installations can be set up in order to develop a complementary infrastructure. For that, we can set up a Belgian-Dutch cooperation or broader, where we set up a common strategy and interaction. And that all to develop a European renewable carbon economy. So it brings me to my final slide. We need to realize that plastics recycling is part of the European circular economy strategy. It's not the only thing. We need to think about how do we maintain the functionality of products at the highest possible level. That's the idea of circularity. So we don't want to discard materials, we want to reuse materials. We want to think about dematerialization of the whole consumption and production system. So recycling is not the only thing to do, but it is part of the overall system. And in all these strategies, in all these goals that the large companies produce, when companies like Coca-Cola, Unilever, they say that they make pleas for higher recycled content, I sometimes miss their pleas for lower material content, for dematerialization, for different models of distribution, different models of consumption and production. So that should also be added into this into this debate. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation, and I thank you.